Hey everyone. In this screencast, I am going to talk about positioning with CSS. So we've talked about, so far, we've talked about a couple different ways that you can create layouts with CSS, or, sort of arrange elements on a page, which of course is a layout. The first is using the display property to basically convert something from a block level to inline or vice versa. That's how we can turn a list into a horizontal menu, which is basically, getting block level elements to sit next to each other. And then we've also used float to get elements to float next to each other. So the examples there would be two boxes sitting next to each other. So like a two or more column layout. Or to get text to wrap around an image or something like that. So the next layout method we're going to talk about is using positioning with CSS. So positioning is can be a little complicated to understand, and there are definitely a lot of issues that come up. So positioning, it's important to understand what positioning is. So I'm going to go through sort of a general overview of what positioning is and the different types of positioning, and then I'm going to end with sort of the best examples of when you would want to use positioning, because I wouldn't recommend only using positioning for your layouts, but there are definite situations where you need to use CSS positioning to do certain things. Okay, so let's jump in. So what I have here is, sort of my standard layout, which is everything is contained inside of a div. I've called it wrapper, given it an ID called wrapper, and I've got a few blocks inside. I'm using the header tag, the main tag. It's got a couple paragraphs and a list, and then a little footer at the bottom. So basically 3 blocks contained inside a div, a wrapper div. So positioning in CSS is basically a way that we can target an element and essentially specify an XY coordinate for that element. So remember, float allows us to sit elements next to each other, but that means the position of the one element is relative to the one before it. With positioning, we have a little more control over exactly where we get an element to sit on the page. So if we go back to the box model for a second, sorry, my dogs are whining in the background. If we go back to the box model for a second, so this little graphic here is a visual representation of the box model. This is the thing that, with CSS helps us understand that every element is contained inside of a box. And every box can have a width, a height, that contains the content. And then outside of the content, you have the padding. Outside of that, you have the border. Outside of that, you have the margin. And you can target all of those and manipulate them. In addition, with CSS positioning, we can also target, so you see this top here, right, bottom, left. It's a little confusing, of course. Top is really the upper left, right is the upper right, bottom is the lower right, left is the lower left. We can target those points of an element and, as I said before, essentially position it on an almost, not exactly like, but almost as though it were on an XY or a two-dimensional grid. So again, the important thing to remember with positioning is that we are able to target an element and position it using its 4 corners, so either one or all 4 of those. Okay, so let's go back to my example here. So with positioning, so the property is literally called position. So we're going to use the position CSS property, and there are different values that are different types of positioning that we can use. So I'm going to go through 4 of those examples. The first one is called absolute positioning. So with absolute positioning, you can target an element and you can say, I want to position that element absolutely. And then when you do that, what you're going to do is then decide which of these corners you want to target and give it a specific pixel value, or you can use relative units like percentages or ems. So let me go through an example here. Oops, I gotta get my examples up here. So I am going to target the header. So again, if we look at my document here, we can see header is first and then main. So they're both on the same level. They're both children of the wrapper div. And that's going to become important in a moment. So I'm going to go up to my CSS. I'm going to leave everything that's already there separate, and I'm just going to sort of add as I go here. So I'm going to target that header div and add the position property. So position is the positioning property in CSS, and I'm going to give it a value of absolute. So I'm telling this div that I'm going to absolutely position it. So as soon as I do that, so I haven't targeted one of the corners yet, I've just said I want to position it. So as soon as I do that and I go refresh, you can see that something has changed. So one of the things that happens when you position, when you use CSS positioning, when you position any element, using any of the values I'm going to go through here, one of the things that happens is that element basically, what it's called is it's pulled out of the normal flow of the document. So the normal flow of the document, so if I go back here, is if we look at my HTML, we have header, and then we have main, and then we have footer. When we go over here, we have the header, and then we have main, and then we have the footer. So that's the normal flow of our document. You have one block level, another block level, another block level. And we're not using floating or anything, so they just all start on their own separate rows. When you position an element, what happens is that element now is sort of pulled out of that flow. So the best way to think about this is if we think about positioning as a two-dimensional grid, when we pull an element out, that element that we have absolutely positioned or just positioned, because this is going to be relevant for the other types of positioning as well, is now basically on its own plane. So this would be the document before the rest of the stuff that's not positioned, and then this second plane is going to be the element that we have positioned. Hold on one second, I have to let my dogs out. Okay, sorry about that. So we can see that the header here, the little box, the black box that says CSS positioning, is basically on top of what's left. What's left being what's in the main block and what's in the footer block. Because it's on its own plane, it basically doesn't know that this other stuff exists. So it's just sitting there layered on top of that other stuff. So this is kind of cool because it essentially allows us to overlap elements on a page. But as we're going to see, it can also get a little confusing and potentially a little messy. Okay, so I have absolutely positioned this element without adding anything else. All that does is it takes it out of the normal flow of the document, puts it on its own plane, and you can see that it's still contained in its container, which would be this div that has that black border. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do here is add this top property. So when we use positioning in CSS, first thing we do is use the position property and we give it a value. The first one we've seen here is absolute. We also have relative positioning, fixed, sticky. I think there's another one that I'm forgetting. So the first thing you do is you say, I want to position it using this style. The second thing you can do is use these other four properties: top, right, bottom, left. So that goes back to these corners. So you can target the top, right, bottom, or left corner, and then specify a pixel value, or like I said before, a relative value. So what I'm going to do is say I want to absolutely position this header element, the black box, and I want to set its top corner to 0. So again, this gets a little confusing. So I've basically set this corner to 0. So the 0 is going to be relative to its nearest positioned parent. So if we go back and look at my code, so header, this is what I'm manipulating, is contained inside of this div. But if we look through my CSS, that wrapper div right here does not have the position property. So that is not a positioned element. So then I have to keep going back up. The body is, that's as far as I can go. The body tag is by default positioned. So what that means is that when I start adding in these values for the, top, right, bottom, left, or we can think of those as the XY, sort of the XY coordinates. As soon as I add in these coordinates, it's going to be relative to the nearest positioned parent. In this case, that is the body, the browser window, in other words. So it sets it to a top of 0 relative to the browser window. So that means the very top of the browser window. It sets its top to 0. And then similarly, I can set its left to 0 as well. So that shifts it all the way over to the edge of the browser window, because the browser window or the body tag is the basically the parent that I'm basing this positioning off of. Okay, so if I go in and make a change here and set the wrapper div, so the thing that it's contained in, to relative. So if I give it a position, if I specify CSS positioning on the wrapper element, and I'm going to set it to relative, which I will explain in a moment, you can see that now those XY coordinates are now being based off the top corner, the top left corner of the wrapper div, not the body. Because now, in terms of absolutely positioning the header, it's looking to its parent elements in whichever one it finds that is that is positioned. It is using that as its starting XY coordinate. Okay, so actually, let me just get rid of that. So that's top and left. We can also, oh yeah, no, actually I'm going to put that back in. So now what I want to do is, so let's go ahead and change this wrapper positioning to absolute instead of relative. And I'm going to add in, so we saw top and left here, I'm going to add in right and bottom so we can see what those look like. So now what I have here is I have targeted the wrapper div, I have absolutely positioned it, and I've set its bottom value and its right value both to 0. So you can see it's smushed it all the way in the bottom right corner. So that's the wrapper. And I've also targeted the header, absolutely positioned that, set it to top and left. And now this is sitting here because the starting X and Y coordinate is based off of its positioned parent, which is this wrapper div. So it's using this point as its starting X and Y instead of this point up here, because the wrapper has been positioned. Again, if I remove this positioning from the wrapper, that header goes all the way in the corner because it's now using this point as its starting X and Y. Okay. So the other thing to remember here that I sort of mentioned is that as soon as you, as I said, as soon as you position an element, it is removed from the normal flow. So it basically sits on its own plane. So anytime you position an element, it is removed and sits on its own plane. So I have now positioned 2 elements. So I basically have 3 different planes here happening. The normal flow, so what's remaining is the main section and the footer section, the header, and the wrapper. So the wrapper and the header are on their own separate planes, and then I have the rest of the document. So because you've got things on different planes, you can have overlap, which could be good, or sometimes, like what we have in this situation, could be bad because you have something sitting on top of another thing, which makes it illegible. So what I'm going to do here is target this property called the Z index. So the Z index has to do with, so we talked about X and Y coordinates. So when you're dealing with, 2 dimensions, you have the X and the Y axis. You also have the Z axis, which is basically that 3rd dimension. So because we have things happening on different planes, we need a way to specify basically the order of those planes, and we do that using the Z index. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target this header, and I'm going to manipulate its Z index, so where it sits in terms of the order of these planes, and I'm going to give it a negative value. So Z index takes numbers, 0 or negative numbers or positive numbers. Positive numbers mean it's going to be higher on the stack. Negative numbers mean it's going to be lower on the stack. So everything, of course, went back down to the bottom and right because I put that code back in there. But the other thing that's happened here is my header has basically disappeared. So I'm going to remove this Z index, refresh. That's where my header should normally show. As soon as I specify a Z index of -1, it goes away. It is still there, but what's happening is I've basically told it to sit behind. So if we think of these planes here, I've told it to be all the way at the bottom of the stack. Then I have the content that's in that gray box on top of it. So I can change this to positive value, and that brings it back. So obviously this can get a little confusing. One thing to keep in mind is, so I'm going to remove that z-index again, and you can see everything is fine. My header actually is still showing up. And part of that is because it has shown up here first in the code. So if I were to move that down here, so I don't have the z-index property at all. Oh, actually, I thought that was gonna work, but it didn't. All right, well, I take back that example. But definitely missing something here. But typically, so when you have layered elements because they've been positioned, they're each given a different z-index value. And the value they're given is typically based on where it is in your code. So you can change where it is in your code if you want to try to get something to sit on top of another thing, and or you can just target the element that you want to be on top and give it a higher z-index value. And you might need to experiment with those values. If you have a lot of positioned elements, then you might have to say, z-index 20 or 100 or 900 just to make sure that the thing you want to sit on top actually sits on top. Okay. So let me do one other thing here. I'm going to change up this code a little bit. So I'm going to target the header, position it absolutely. I'm going to have it sit on the left edge of its nearest positioned parent. And I'm going to set its width to 200 pixels. I'm also going to target the main property. So I've got the black box and then the gray box. And I'm also going to position that absolutely. And that's going to be relative to its nearest positioned parent. So both of these, of course, have the wrapper div as its parent. But I've changed all of my code up here so that the wrapper div is not currently positioned. So that means it's going to be relative to the body tag, because that's the next thing up. So I'm going to also absolutely position the main tag, and okay, set it to top. So when I refresh, you can see I now have both of these elements sitting next to each other. So this is sort of similar to what we saw with float. So we can use position in the position property with CSS to create layouts. So I've targeted both of these elements. I've said position them absolutely. With the header, I've said put it in the left top corner of its nearest positioned parent and give it a width of 200 pixels. With the gray box, position it absolutely, also relative to its nearest position parent, which is also the body tag, so the upper left corner of the browser window. But set its left property, so top, same thing all the way to the top, but set its left property to 220 pixels. So if I set both of them to left 0, they're going to just stack on top of each other. And here's that example where you can see the thing that shows up later in the document, the main tag, sits on top in terms of its z-index. So I could target the header, give it a value of 100. Now it's on top if I wanted. Still, what's in the gray box is not readable, so I'm going to adjust the left edge of the gray box, move it over 200 some pixels. So now it's sitting to the side of it. And you can see they're still sort of overlapping. So, there's going to be a lot of trial and error with the exact pixel values that you want to use or relative values if that's what you're trying to do. So, again, this is another approach to layouts. Obviously, this is a little more involved because you're dealing with, sort of the 2-dimension and 3 dimensions. And you always have to be aware of in terms of the thing that you're targeting to position, you always have to be aware of what it's being positioned relative to. So either it's direct parent or its nearest positioned parent. Okay, let me just sort of quickly go through the other types of positioning. So that is absolute positioning. The next one is relative positioning. So anytime you position an element with a value other than static is just the default value. So the way that block level elements behave naturally is static positioning. So you rarely have to actually target something and say position it statically, because that's just the natural behavior. As soon as you target an element and specify position absolute, which we just went over, or position relative, which I'm going to show you right now, or fixed or sticky, any of those values, as soon as you apply one of those positioning values, that element automatically is removed from the natural flow of the document, as I said before. So that's where we have that sort of 3-dimension thing happening, and things are not going to, that element therefore is not going to behave as expected in terms of its box model elements. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show you relative positioning. So I'm going to target the header. Actually, sorry, before I write this, let me save and set this back to its regular state. So I'm going to target the header, say position relative. So relative is going to be the X and Y starting point is going to be relative to where that element would have normally shown up. So what I mean is, so without any positioning, this black box, my header, this is where this upper left corner, that XY, that's where this would normally show without any positioning. So I'm going to say position relative, top 40 pixels, left 100 pixels. So again, relative is this starting XY coordinate is going to be relative to where it would have normally started, which would be here. So I'm saying top, and top is a little confusing, of course, because I'm pushing it down, but I'm saying its top starting point is going to be 40 pixels from where it would normally start, and what did I say, 100 pixels over from where it would normally start. So top in this instance is actually pushing it down, left of course is actually pushing it right, which can get a little confusing, but I'm saying its left edge is now going to be at, or its top and left edge is basically going to be at, in terms of an X and Y coordinate, I guess that would be 100 pixels, 40 pixels. So that's relative. Again, absolute positioning is the starting X and Y coordinate is going to be relative to its nearest positioned parent. Relative is going to be starting X and Y coordinate relative to where it would have normally shown without any positioning at all. Actually, let me show you just a quick real life example. So this is a client site, and I remembered that I used relative positioning to get this effect here. So these are, sort of little call to action boxes with some stories with a little read more button. So to get this little, these little like blue and brown boxes to show up in the upper right corner and these brown boxes to show up in the middle, sort of layered on top of the image and layered on top of the excerpt box. The only way to do that is with positioning, because again, positioning, as soon as you target an element and position it, it pulls it out of the natural flow of the document. So if we inspect this code, I'm going to increase the font size here. So this, let me make this a little bigger. So this whole box, this first one, contained inside of a div. That little publications blue or teal box is a separate div. And then we have the image, separate div, the title, that brown box, separate div, and then the excerpt, the text, separate div. So if we look at that first box, the publications box, and we look at this code, you can see it's position absolute, and I've set its right edge to 10 pixels. So if I'm using the inspector here, of course, if I just disable positioning, you can see that normally the natural flow of this code, so this is the wrapper, first child of that wrapper is this blue box here, or green box, and then the image. So the natural flow would be div, block level, new row, div, block level. But as soon as I turn on positioning, it's removed from that natural flow and it's now able to layer or sit or overlap on top of that image. Okay, so that's just a real life example of positioning. Let me go back to my last two examples here. The other two examples of positioning, let me get back to where we started, are sticky and fixed. So sticky is what you would use, actually, let me go back. So like on the Google Fonts site, for example, and you see this on many sites, when I scroll, so I'm just on Google Fonts, when I start scrolling, this navigation up here, this white bar, so let me do this one more time. So this, I'm all the way at the top of the page, and notice that as soon as I start scrolling, this box sort of gets to the top and then sits there as I scroll through the rest of the page. So that's what is called a sticky header. We can do something similar with this example over here. So I'm going to basically target this header again and set its position property to sticky and top to 0. So sticky basically tells an element once it gets to whatever you've specified with the top, bottom, right, or left values, once it gets to that point, you're basically, by telling it to have a position of sticky, you're basically telling it to get to that point and then stop and just sit there regardless of how much the user is scrolling. So to see this in action, I actually have to add some more content to this page. Okay, so header, targeting the header, position sticky, top 0, and that's it. So now as I scroll, so you can see there's a little bit of a margin here, but so I said top 0, so as soon as the top gets to 0 of its parent, then it sticks there as I scroll the page. And if I scroll back up, it goes back to where it started. So that's a pretty common thing that a lot of websites do for a header or a footer, or like a navigational element. Like as you scroll, once that navigational element gets to a certain point, it sticks there, and then the rest of the content scrolls as the user scrolls through the page. Okay, so that's sticky, and then the last thing I want to show here is, actually let me get rid of the extra content. The last thing I want to show is fixed. So actually, if we go back to the Google font site, let's select a style. Oh, there we go. So when you're on the Google font site, an example of fixed positioning is this bar over here. So it's a little different than sticky. Sticky, again, will move up to the point you tell it to, and then it sticks. Fixed, you're basically telling it to just stay in one spot the whole time. So as I scroll the rest of the site, you can see that this bar over on the right, rather, stays fixed, stays in place, regardless, again, of how much I'm scrolling other elements around it. So let me go back to my demo here. I'm going to get rid of the sticky, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to target my footer, and I've given it a class called fixed. I don't necessarily need to use a class in this case, but let's say that I'm building a website and I have other elements that I want to apply this style to, so maybe I use a class. So I'm going to say find the thing that has the class called fixed and position it using the fixed value, and oops, I'm going to use bottom right 0. So now you can see, here's my footer. Previously, let me just disable this for a moment. Previously, that's where it showed. Again, that's just the normal place it would show based on the flow of the document. As soon as I position it using fixed, and then I'm saying bottom right, so the bottom right corner, it extracts from the natural flow of the document. It's now in its own separate plane, and I've told it specifically to go to the bottom. I've positioned it, its starting XY coordinates based on its bottom right corner. And I've given both of those values 0, which is why it's all the way in that bottom right edge. Actually, let me add some more content here. So this, sort of like the sticky thing, is going to just sit in the same spot, and the rest of the page is going to move independently from that fixed element that I just created. Let's see, so yeah, so that's about it. So that's positioning. As you can see, it gets a little complicated. The basic idea, though, is that you can use positioning to get a little bit more specific with essentially the X and Y coordinates. Of course, we're not literally dealing with X and Y coordinates. We essentially have 4 corners that we can manipulate. We can target one or more of those corners and place it on the page relative to where it would normally show, which would be relative positioning, or relative to its nearest position parent, which would be absolute positioning, or we can tell it to be fixed in one spot, or we can do the sticky thing, which basically tells it to scroll as normal until it gets to a certain spot and then sit there until the user scrolls back. So positioning can be used for layouts. I don't typically recommend using only positioning for layouts. I would use floats, or I would use flexbox or grid, which is going to be the next screencast that I make. Those are a little newer and haven't been as commonly used because some of the browsers, mostly Internet Explorer, haven't been as quick to adapt them, but flexbox and grid are becoming much more of the preferred or best way to do layouts. So again, for layouts, meaning like 2 columns, 3 columns, I don't recommend using only positioning. I would do floats or flexbox or grid. But positioning does come into into play when you need to have an element layered on top of another, like I showed you with this site here. So the only way to do this is with positioning. You can also use positioning for those sticky headers or footers, or some kind of navigation, or if you need to have a fixed element on a page, so you need it to just sit in the same spot and not scroll with the rest of the page. You'd use positioning for that. And another very common example of positioning is when you have like a pop-up or some kind of overlay or some kind of animation that needs to sit on top of the rest of your content and be positioned and behave independently from the rest of your page. Okay, so that's positioning. Sorry this was so long. It, as I said, can get a little confusing. There are a lot of examples out there. So I will put up all of these examples that I went through. I'll have it linked from the YouTube video. And of course, if you have any questions or want some additional examples or other examples of where you would use positioning, just let me know and I'll try to answer your questions and point you in the right direction. That's it. Thanks.